Hello, this is Jay Mitchell. We are back for another episode of Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. First, we have McConnell aide finally cornered on why there was no video of a senator, posted by Donald Key, and that's cross post from the No Filter News subreddit. And that looks like an article from the Daily Beast. McConnell aide finally cornered on why there's no video of senator. The senator's team has remained astonishingly tight-lipped about their boss's health. And yeah, personally, I think that, he's likely probably brain dead, but they won't go out and say that because they just want to have, go on to the next election. So there's more place to see it because, they don't want any outsider in there. They just want their brain dead neocon in there, and that's pretty much what Mitch McConnell was even before he had the stroke or whatever he had. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have records show the government illegally surveyed James Comey and confirmed the absurdity of its case against him. Post from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't think the government should be illegally surveying anyone. But with that being said, James Comey is very much a deep state actor. He was, I think, for the president of the FBI or something for years. So, personally, I don't really care that they're going after him. But it's interesting how Reddit suddenly loves him now since the Orange Man's going after him, even though they hated him 10 years ago when he did the October surprise against Hillary and said they were going to reopen investigations into her emails just days before the 2016 election. But it just goes to show you, Reddit will follow whatever the narrative is. When James Comey was bad 10 years ago, he's the worst thing ever. But now that the Orange Man's going after him, suddenly he's the best thing ever. Personally, I don't really care. I think it's all just theater. James Comey's just one of the deep state military-industrial complex satanic cabal of lizard people, really running the show from behind the scenes rather than any actual libertarians. So, I personally don't think the government should be illegally surveilling anyone, but, that I personally, if they want to illegally surveil James Comey, I personally wouldn't really care too much in that case. Next, we have flock cameras are getting mobbed, posted by Donald Key, and that's a cross post from the technology subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think, the libertarian position is, we shouldn't have government cameras watching everyone everywhere, but ultimately the government's in a position where it can watch you wherever pretty much it feels like, and ultimately, they have the monopoly on the legal use of force, just fighting pretty much wherever they want to. So yeah, personally, I don't really care for flock cameras. I personally justify probably taking a lot of them down if I saw them, but I personally don't want to get into trouble with the law because that just I don't really care too much for them, but I don't really get into trouble with the law and all that. That's just gonna screw you up for a little. The best thing you do with the law is just kind of ignore it and hope they don't come after you for whenever they want to justify coming after you. You don't want to make yourself a target by taking down the flock cameras, if you ask me. But if you want to justify taking down the flock cameras, I probably wouldn't report you for doing so. I don't really care for government surveillance, be it online or offline. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Taylor Farm spent big on MAGA and anti-regulatory lobbying before diarrhea outbreak, hosted by Donald Key, and that's cross-post from the politics subreddit. And yeah, personally, it just goes to show you that people are going to act in their own self-interest, and that includes big companies. They're going to always justify lobbying for their own self-interest. I personally don't really care for, the Taylor Farms, and it's, I don't know I think they said that the lettuce, their lettuce might not have been the one that was inducing the diarrhea outbreak, but regardless, ultimately, this is just another example of how people are going to act in their own self-interest, and that includes both big companies and the elected officials, who are oftentimes very much one and the same. Next, we have Todd Blanche's nomination is in trouble. It should have been doomed from the beginning, from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't really care. I think he's supposed to be the Attorney General to replace Pam Bondi. I personally don't think it really matters who's the Attorney General. I don't think it matters who's in a lot of government positions. They're not really the ones running the show. Who's really running the show is, the alphabet agencies, deep state military industrial complex, satanic cabal, lizard people, whatever you want to call them. They're the ones who are really running the show. We probably don't really know the names of the people who are actually in charge, the bureaucrats and all them. This is just a distraction from that. The president and the executive branch might seem like they have all the power, and in some ways they do. They're the ones who ultimately enforce the laws compared to the legislative branch and Supreme Court, which, make and interpret the laws respectively. But, ultimately, even the executive branch, they are really controlled by, I would say, the alphabet agencies within them, like the FBI, CIA, NSA, rather than actually being controlled by the supposedly elected officials or even the appointed officials for that matter. Next, we have Malay signs a decree allowing Argentina to bar or expel foreigners over quote-unquote hate speech posted by LegioX, and that's cross-post from the World News subreddit, and that looks like an article from the BA Times, and Buenos Aires Times. And yeah, personally, I think Malay's he's economically pretty good from a libertarian perspective, but socially he does leave some stuff to be desired. I don't really think you should be arresting people or expelling them for what you deem to be hate speech. As a libertarian, I believe hate speech and misinformation. If you want to lift label speech as that's fine. But those are all fundamentally free speech, and just because you don't like it doesn't mean that you should make it illegal. But ultimately those positions of state authority can justify doing whatever they want to, and if they want to justify going after you for what they deem to be hate speech, they have the ability to do so. It's like the woman in Minnesota who said the N-word recently in the park against some Somali immigrant, and now the state's going after her. I personally think if you want to justify yelling the N-word at black people, I personally wouldn't do that. I think that's kind of wrong, but ultimately that is freedom of speech, and you have every right to do it if you feel like it. So just because but anyway, just because I disagree with Malay on this and Israel doesn't mean that he's probably isn't one of the, he's still probably one of the better world leaders from a libertarian perspective, especially when it comes to economics. But regardless, anyone in a position of state authority can only be so libertarian because they do have to enforce the state's laws, and that is ultimately going to be unlibertarian when you're enforcing laws on other people who don't consent to them. Next, we have Commerce Department quietly announces 7 new equity stakes in private companies from thehill.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't think the government should be getting involved with equity stakes in private companies, but ultimately, it can justify doing whatever it feels like. I personally think that's socialism, if not downright communism. But ultimately, Donald Trump is supposedly the anti-communist candidate. I would say in a lot of ways, he's just as communist as the Democratic Socialists of America who are taking over the Democratic Party. In reality, I think both parties are increasingly just vehicles for socialism/communism, and ultimately there's really nothing you can do about it. Next, we have Tennessee governor candidate says he'll ban mosques and non-Christian religions if elected, posted by Woke Man, and that's a cross post from the underreported news subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think that goes against the First Amendment freedom of religion. But ultimately, if the state's in a position to enforce that, that's on them. I personally don't really care for a lot of Muslims. They tend to not be very libertarian, even more so than a lot of unlibertarian Christians. But ultimately, I think if you want to have them open up a mosque or a temple for any non-Christian religion, I think you should be able to, and I don't think it matters what the state says. Next, we have Chicago homeowner sues border cops for warrantless raid from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I think, you should be able to sue whoever you want for whatever reason you want to. I definitely don't think that any government or agency should be doing warrantless raids. I don't even think they should be doing the wolf warrants, to tell you the truth. But ultimately, I do think, they should be held accountable for their warrantless raid. But oftentimes the state's not ever going to be held accountable for its own actions because they control the courts and legal systems, and they're oftentimes not willing to hold themselves accountable for their own wrongdoings. Next, we have This Is What All the Winning Looks Like, More Oil Subsidies and Infinite Wars Please, posted by Woke Man, and that's a cross post from the Energy subreddit, and that's a story from Common Dreams. Exxon Chevron post $26.5 billion in combined profits as high gas prices pummel Americans. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but ultimately, that's very much how people are going to work. They're going to be focused on the profit line first and foremost rather than affordability, and that's just how, why we should have, ultimately, as many probably diverse systems of fuel as possible, rather than just the over centralization on oil like we have currently. But I think it's interesting though. One of the people who's been biggest about doing that was Elon Musk, who Reddit used to love, but then suddenly he joined the political out group, and then he was the worst thing ever. And it just goes to show you, the Redditors have no principles, only teams. They'll defend the oil companies if the narrative says to. We're going after the one of the biggest names in electric cars if the narrative says to, and they just really care about nothing other than what letter people have next to their name at any given moment. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Sony Q1 fiscal year 2026 results. 47% increase in profit thanks to U.S. tariffs refunds, no planned refunds to customers. And that's posted by Woke Man. That's cross-posted from the technology subreddit. And that's a link from this story from thisweekinvideogames.com. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that. But that's ultimately how big business works. You know, big business is concerned about its profits first and foremost, rather than the money that consumers spend. You know, ultimately, I think that's why the libertarian perspective is you gotta prioritize small business over big business. But ultimately, ultimately when it comes to big business, you're not forced to interact with them a lot of time. You know, if you don't like what Sony's doing, you're free to not buy a PlayStation or whatever. I think that's important to remember as well. Next, we have Minority Report. FBI seeks AI for political watch list from Reason.com, posted by LegioX. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that. But, ultimately, if the FBI wants to justify using AI for whatever purpose it wants to use it for, that's on them. I personally don't really care for that. But, I think the libertarian position is, we have to abolish the FBI entirely. And that's not what Redditors would say. Redditors would say, just the right people need to be in control of the FBI. They'll suddenly start defending the FBI again the second the Democrats take power. And it just goes to show you that, ultimately, the two major parties might be against the deep state when they're out of power, but the second they get back into power, they'll be for the deep state. It's exactly why, the Republicans were critical of the FBI during the Biden years, but now suddenly they're in control of the FBI and they don't really care anymore about the FBI and its abuses of power. Next we have Hands Up, who felt attacked by this post by Schultz Sister Morons, and that's a comic. It looks like an ANCOM political compass ball and ANCAP political compass ball. And the ANCAP political compass ball says, "Thanks for buying my painting," and the ANCAP says, "My pleasure." Then a week later says, the ANCOM ball says, "Still enjoying that painting," and the ANCAP ball actually says, "Actually sold it. The buyer offered double what I paid for it." And then the ANCOM ball says, "I'm actually helping being robbed. He stole my surplus labor." And the ANCAP ball says, "Are you okay?" And yeah, personally, I think, that's the libertarian position is, if you want to buy something, you should be able to. If you want to sell it for more than you get it for, you should be able to as well. The Marxist labor theory of value isn't very much a libertarian. Just because someone works hard on something doesn't mean you should have to pay them more for it than someone who worked less on something. Ultimately, when it comes to labor, it's going to be the value is going to be inherently subjective rather than objective. Next, we have ISIS shredding the Bill of Rights, defending that isn't conservative, from Reason.com, posted by Jai Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for ICE. But, ultimately, a lot of government agencies and the government itself have shown no care for the Bill of Rights over the past couple centuries. But suddenly, ICE doesn't, and Reddit thinks it's the worst thing ever. Reddit only doesn't care about ICE doing it because, they're out-group rather than in-group. But when they take power again, they'll suddenly stop caring. But when the Democrats take power again, Reddit will suddenly stop caring about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights so much. But now that the out-group's in power, they're suddenly the most sacred things to them. It's just to show you they have no values, only teams. They'll throw those Bill of Rights and the Constitution back under the rug the second it becomes opportune to do so. Next we have Justice Department admits reflecting pool renovation was flawed, drops case against former Olympian, posted by Ninja Lover, and that's crosswords from the Uplifting News subreddit. It's a story from CNN, it looks like. And yeah, I personally don't really care for all the reflecting pool discourse. I think that's very much, it's WWE stuff rather than actual issues. But yeah, personally, I think that, if the Justice Department is admitting that it was flawed, I think that's good. Normally government doesn't hold themselves accountable for anything, so that's a rare example of them doing so. And yeah, that's my faults there. Next, we have Trump's tariffs will cost each American household $900 in 2026, posted by Jai Porcupine, and that's a story from Reason.com. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for tariffs. They're just a tax on imported goods. I do think people should buy local, but I don't think the government should be forced to be able to buy local through a tax on imported goods. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Trump's fixation on Arctic ships leads to billions into no-bid contracts, posted by Woke Boogeyman, and that's crosspost from the politics subreddit. That looks like a story from the New York Times. And yeah, personally, I think that, the libertarian positions, Arctic ships, like all other kinds of ships, should be primarily the domain of the private sector rather than that of the public sector, same with pretty much everything else. Next, we have Homeland Security spending $1 billion on autonomous border surveillance towers, posted by Jedi Porcupine. That's a story from Reason.com. And yeah, personally, I don't think we should be spending $1 billion on autonomous border surveillance towers, but ultimately, if the government wants to throw $1 billion at them, they can throw money wherever they feel like. Oftentimes, it's never going to even be built. And, sometimes, the government's going to spend money on what you don't want to, what you don't like. I'm sure when the Democrats take power, Reddit will be for them them funneling their money into all their woke progressive NGO friends. But right now, since the Republicans are in power, they don't like anything the government's spending all their money on. And I think ultimately, you got to always be critical of what the government's spending on, regardless of how much you like it. And that definitely includes a lot of so-called conservatives when it comes to all this border security stuff. Next, we have Just Let Them In, Bro, or Else You're Racist, posted by ShowNets5462, and that's a cross post from the Base Camp Pod subreddit, and that looks like a video. Thousands of migrants from Spain's Ceuta border from Morocco, thousands of migrants storm Spain's Ceuta border from Morocco in mass swimming invasion. And yeah, personally, I think libertarian position is, borders are ultimately going to be subjective rather than objective a lot of times. If people want to enforce a border, I think that's fine. I definitely do think, you shouldn't have unchecked immigration, especially with the current welfare state in place. But with that being said, ultimately people are going to justify what they justify. If I personally think this, this might be, one of the things I've heard is that, this might be Israel's punishment for Spain being so anti-Zionist that they're teaming up with Morocco to send as many refugees into the Moroccan, the Spanish parts on the Moroccan mainland to destabilize and have Morocco take them over. But, ultimately, it just goes to show you that, if people want to use, a lot of times refugees like this are used as a weapon to destabilize and destroy cultural homogeneity and take over parts of the country, so that it's through the process of a narco tyranny, where the state will import as many brown people as possible to destroy cultural homogeneity and let them do whatever they want because they're foot soldiers of the ruling class, and ultimately, there's really nothing you can do about it. But yeah, ultimately, this goes to show you the state is always going to justify using whatever it feels like, doing whatever it feels like, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Ultimately, if it were up to me, I think, the territories in Spain would be privatized, and then the people could enforce their border however they feel like, because it would be a private, the state wouldn't be in control of it, and then it wouldn't be state authoritarians, it would be private authoritarians, and private authoritarians isn't always perfect, but at the very least, it wouldn't be the state, and yeah, they could enforce their border and stop all those Muslim migrants from coming in, but ultimately, ultimately, if they want to just start coming in, they have the ability to do it. I guess if you want to just start using force against them, that's fine. But I think state force is probably never the answer, and maybe private force would be a little bit better. But yeah, that's my thoughts there. Next, we have one California town found Flock's license plate cameras were wrong 71% of the time. Posted by Stacks Over, and that's crosspost from the Technology subreddit, and that's a story from TechSpot.com. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for Flock's license plate cameras to begin with, so this is definitely never a reason to just get rid of them. But ultimately, I think the government's just going to keep using them as a tool to go after anyone who wants to go after it at any given moment. Next, we have LAPD officer who recorded colleagues' racist comments charged with felony eavesdropping, posted by Stacks Over, and that's crossed from the politics subreddit. It's a story from LA Times. And yeah, personally, I think that, if they want to, it just goes to show you they can arrest you for whatever reason they feel like. Ultimately, sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. Next, we have new THC rules that will take effect in Texas. What's legal, what's banned, posted by Stacks Over, and that's a crosspost from the politics subreddit from its story from USA Today. New THC rules take effect in Texas. What's legal, what's banned. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is that nothing should be illegal or banned. Just by doing whatever you want, whatever thing you want to. If you want to just by using THC, you should be able to. With that being said, the state can just by enforcing whatever law it feels like, and that includes banning and enforcement of banning whatever product it feels like. Next, we have The Economic Cost of Chaos is Real and Rising from Cato.org, posted by Valencia 5563. And yeah, I would agree with that, but ultimately, it just goes to show you that, chaos is kind of inevitable these days. I'm sure that when the Democrats take power and the world's still in a chaotic mess, Reddit will suddenly start still make all the excuses around the book. But right now, since the out-group's in power rather than the in-group, Reddit thinks it's just going to throw them under the bus for it. Next, we have Kansas lawsuit. ALPR has turned a license plate into the functional equivalent of a GPS tracking device from Reason.com, posted by Jai Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that. But, ultimately, if they want to justify tracking your license plate wherever they want to track it, ultimately there's nothing you can really do about it. The license plate is already the domain of the state from the DMV. So ultimately, I think the libertarian position is you gotta get rid of license plates entirely rather than just use them as a tool to track people. But I don't know how realistic that would be at ever happening. Next, we have which politician is dumber, posted by socialist or morons, and they said, I'm really unsure. I initially thought AOC, but moron Mamdani, subsidized government grocery stores are making me reconsider. What do you think is dumber of the two? And all the ultimate moron of NIC. And then they linked to a poll about that. And yeah, personally, I think they're both idiots, but ultimately, it just goes to show you that the media might treat them good because they're part of their agenda to destroy America through socialist, mostly minorities. But ultimately, I think libertarian position is, if you want to think one of them's worse than the other, that's fine. I personally think, it's okay to not care for either of them. I personally don't really care for either of them. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. And I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.